Happy Sunday, everybody. I hope you all have had an amazing week and a great weekend. I appreciate all of you that are going to be joining us for this live. And for those of you that may not be joining us for this live and might catch this later, I welcome you at that time as well. Last week, we started our journey with Noah. We are working our way over the next couple months, diving into some old, very common Bible stories that are used a lot, especially for children's Sunday school. But I wanted to take time to dive back into them to see what maybe got a little sugar coated, to put it as nicely as I can, and healthily as I can, so that we can understand more and more of some of the Bible stories that we grew up with, and maybe find some deeper meanings in them that we often think children can't necessarily grasp. Although I have always said I think we don't give children near the credit that they deserve when it comes to their ability to get a lot of things. So, last week, like I said, we started Jonah. And as we know, Jonah was a prophet with quite a troubled history. He was a prophet that was given instructions by God to go to a very dangerous city. He didn't like the instructions given to him. He didn't want to go. And he decided to try to hide. And he kind of completely forgot that you can't really hide from God. God knows what you're doing at all times. He fled towards Tarshish on a boat. And shortly after they were out to sea, a storm took over. The crew figured out it was Jonah that caused the storm. So they kind of accounted for his life. Which we can trace that back to Noah, when one of the final things that God commands of Noah and his family as they rebuild the earth, for lack of a better word, or restart Earth Point 2, or Earth 2.0, God says you need to have an accounting for all animals killed and for all human life. You need to have an accounting for it. So anyway, the crew gives an accounting for Jonah's life before throwing him overboard. And the crew developed a brand new faith in God while Jonah was kind of left treading water. So let's also remember where Jonah was actually being called to. So right away in the first chapter of Jonah, in the first few verses, we hear God tell Jonah, you're going to go to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was not a very friendly place at all. It was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. It was primarily consisting of pagans and Gentiles. And I actually really love how VeggieTales described it in the Jonah movie. The people of Nineveh were horrible to the Israelites. They lied, they stole, they slapped people with fishes. And if only that was actually true, and the worst of it. Nineveh was a very intense city, very cruel and dangerous, especially for the Israelites. They could easily be killed for their faith. Now, I want us to put ourselves in Jonah's shoes. You know, if we were Jonah and we were told to do something very similar, which was to go to this very dangerous city and to tell all of the people of this city to repent their actions. And by the way, you're being called alone. It's not like you have, you know, a whole group of people going with you. You know, would you be willing to go? Jonah didn't want to go. And he didn't want to go not just because of the danger aspect, but Jonah didn't feel like the people of Nineveh deserved mercy from God, and he didn't want to rescue the Assyrians from God's judgment and wrath. So now we have Jonah hanging out. He's treading water after being thrown overboard. Let's find out what happens. So today's reading comes from the 17th verse of the first chapter through the 10th verse of the second chapter. It says, Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threaten me, the deep surround me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down to the earth. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When the life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Now, we need to have just a small context to understand some of this. And I'm going to give you a little bit of Hebrew. Verse 17 of the first chapter says, the Lord provided a huge fish. And that's the NIV is the Bible that I prefer to use. That's just the translation that I personally understand the best. And it's been very common teaching, especially when it comes to children's Bible stories, to teach that Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Now, we don't actually know that to be fact. The Hebrew word, if we go back to the Hebrew and we translate directly from the Hebrew says dag gadol, or great fish. So we don't actually have, there is not a Hebrew word for whale, technically. There are many scholars that debated that it could have been a species of whale because that would have been common for the area they were in. And many species of whale are able to swallow very large objects. No matter if it was a whale or a sea monster, or I think one commentary that I had read once upon a time called it a sea dog, something like that. The Hebrew translation tells us Jonah was swallowed by a great fish of some kind. So now there are some who find it very hard to believe that Jonah was swallowed by a whale or a great fish or a sea monster. But interestingly enough, this specific situation is quoted by Jesus in the Gospel according to Matthew. In the 12th chapter of Matthew, Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So if people question as to whether or not this was just a very weird translation of what actually happened to Jonah, we hear it then restated by Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospel according to Matthew. So we've got that going for us. Now, while Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, he literally had nothing better to do than to pray. And I want to point out and reiterate that Jonah was a very rebellious and also a very resistant believer. And rebellious and resistant seems like it would contradict with the term believer. But we see it again and again in folks throughout our holy teachings and throughout our Christ-following heritage and our history. Now, God could have chosen to just have Jonah kind of swallowed and that's the end of it. But God clearly didn't want to do that. He did not want to kill Jonah. God wanted to preserve the life of Jonah. And in a weird way, God uses Jonah to teach us a very easy and basic principle. God will always win. Jonah is the best example, in my opinion, of what happens when God gives us a purpose. We choose to walk away or to run because we don't want to do it. And then through other happenings, our attention is suddenly redirected back to God. God will work somehow in our lives. So after 3 days, Jonah decides to offer a prayer, and we're going to break down parts of that prayer. Jonah, in his prayer, states that God heard his cry, and Jonah knew God would deliver him. So Jonah is now demonstrating his faith, and he also acknowledges how God can provide peace in the worst of circumstances. Another thing that we need to be aware of is that Jonah's points that he makes throughout his prayer are pulled, interestingly enough, from several parts of Psalms. So it's almost like Jonah is literally praying the Psalms, which are in their own right prayers and songs, all in one. So Jonah says that he was cast into the deep. Now this was Jonah admitting that it wasn't really the crew that threw him into the sea. I mean, it was in the literal sense. Jonah was more hinting that he was into the sea because it was the right thing to do. It was God is really the one that threw him into the sea. God casts him into the sea. Even when he tried to run from God, God was always there. Jonah says, I have been cast out of your sight. Okay, can we point out the fact that the craziness and chaos of the situation was Jonah himself? He got himself into this situation. Jonah got himself into the situation, but that's not what was bothering him the most. Oh, no, 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 no. It was the fact that through Jonah's choices, he realized that he separated himself from God. But then Jonah recognizes that God is the one that pulled him out of the pit. Now, God realistically is the great fixer. I don't know about you. I'm not as bad about it. I do have my moments where I prefer to fix problems. If I see a problem, I want to fix it. But I am also not that person that will go out of my way to fix it, because I'm a person that realizes sometimes things just have to be. Like, you can't fix everything. But maybe some of you can identify with this need to fix problems all the time. But one of the things that I do feel like we all need to do and could do better as a society is practicing what's called pit sitting. God is the number one pit sitter. And what I mean is if you've ever been in a situation or maybe a life circumstance in your life where things have just felt so low, you felt like there was no way up. You were almost like you were dug in a 10-foot deep pit. You've got no rope, no ladder to get out. You're just stuck in this like pit of despair. Sometimes the best thing any one of us can do for somebody in that situation is to crawl down into the pit and sit with them and wait with them. Listen to them. Encourage them before we try to help them out. Because if folks don't hear what they are saying and process their own emotions, they cannot learn, grow, and change from it. They rely on everyone else to fix their problems when we as human beings have to own our own problems. We have to fix them. Other people can be there as we walk through the journey. Just as God pulled Jonah out of the pit, God sat in the pit with him for 3 days and 3 nights. The pit in this instance was the belly of a great fish, but I'd say that that's a pretty good pit. God was present with Jonah while Jonah cried out and processed everything that he had done and what led him to be where he was. Just like God was a pit sitter for Jonah, we need to be a pit sitter for one another. Jonah goes on in his prayer to talk about idolaters. Jonah is stating that when we choose to turn and run from God, when we choose to resist a purpose that God has for our life, it is no different than being an idolater. And I get where he's coming from. Because what he is pretty much saying is, if your focus is not on the mission, work, whatever it may be, that God has called you to do, if God is not at the center, then whatever is at your center is what you worship. That is what you idolize. Jonah goes on and repents to God and is now finally willing to go where God initially wanted him to go. Jonah makes a major declaration in doing so. Can we just point out how many times do each one of us, and I guarantee you any of you watching this have probably been there, done that, because I know I've done it. Why is it that we can delay doing something we need to do? We've got the time to delay it, but we don't have the time to do it when we're supposed to. And then once we get it done, we go, oh, that didn't take so long. Oh, that wasn't so bad. I think my mom has a magnet on her fridge, and I really wish I could remember it word for word, but I think it's like a picture of a clock, and I think it says, amazing how we have time to do things twice, but not time to do it right the first time, or something along those lines. And I think of that when I think of this point. Like, Jonah is now, after 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, willing to go where he's called. Then he makes a very important statement. Jonah uses God's proper name. The word Lord is in all capital letters, and when we see that in the Old Testament, that is God's most proper name. Jonah says salvation is of Yahweh. Salvation is of Yahweh. Salvation is from Yahweh. That is a huge statement for Jonah to now make. Then we hear that God commands the fish. So can we also realize that the fish was under God's command when it swallowed Jonah? Jonah's out there treading water. God was like, hey, I need you to kind of swallow this guy for me. And the big fish was like, got it. So then Jonah comes to his senses, and God said, okay, you can let him go now. So Jonah is then expelled from the fish. Can we also point out the fact that in more than one aspect of our Holy Scriptures, we see how animals listen way better than humans do? I find that entirely amusing because it's kind of true. So Jonah probably in his mind would have wished he'd have been let go as close to Nineveh as possible so he didn't have to walk. But considering he was in the Mediterranean Sea and Nineveh is about 300 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, I don't think that the whale would have been able to release him with that kind of magnitude. But Jonah had to give his life to God. He really didn't have any other choice at this point. I mean, he did, but not really. After 3 days and 3 nights of being stuck in the belly of a fish, he was now free. It says that Jonah was expelled onto dry land. I reworded that a little. And he now had a nice little jaunt to get to Nineveh. So Jonah decides after 3 days to cry out and pray to God. That's the whole gist of today's message, and this particular part of Jonah is the prayer Jonah offers. He could have easily been angry and explained to God why he didn't want to go to Nineveh and how this should be his right, because after all, Jonah had the right to choose. Jonah did choose. Jonah chose to try to go the opposite way. He had that right. The one thing, though, that we can really learn from this part of Jonah's story is when we knowingly choose a path we know we're not supposed to be on, we also need to understand that we can't blame God for that. I am guilty of doing it. I'm guilty of shaking my fist, not out of anger at God, or I'm sorry, not out of anger of something I chose, but just needing to blame God for something that was going wrong in my life. Some of it was my doing. I have a lot of past stories that I could tell you of things that I did that were not the best choices in my life. And there were situations that I was in that had nothing to do with my own choices. They were just life events, and I got angry and blamed God for it. We are allowed to get angry at God. God can take it. God does not care if we get angry at him. But what we need to understand is we don't have the right to blame God when we make choices that we know we're not supposed to make. We don't get the ability at that point to shake our fist at God with a "how dare you" when things aren't going the way we want them to go, because we chose to do things that we knew we shouldn't have done. Not every situation we suddenly get into is going to be easy. Not every situation God wants you to be a part of is going to be quick. Not every situation that you're called to be a part of is going to sit well with your friends and family. Folks aren't going to get it. But maybe your presence in a situation, your willingness to follow a request and to do something that might seem uncomfortable to you, could have an impact that you will never truly realize. You don't know how your presence in a situation can change the results, even if it's a little bit of an imprint on someone's heart. You may not be able to stop something from completely happening, but you don't know what your presence could do for one person or one situation. We have the right. Are we going to choose to do our own thing and then get angry when things don't go our way? Or are we going to choose to kind of trust God and see how we can be used to make things better and to make our lives better? It's up to us. Next week, we're going to be journeying with Jonah as he enters into Nineveh. So I hope you guys will stay tuned. Have a great week ahead, and I will see you next week.